Thank you, Darren. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Darren, don't worry about pronouncing my name. I've had worse. When I got my first job at Cambridge, I remember the master of the college introduced me as the Greek with a dirty name. So, well, Theresa May. What a week she's had. 2 days before the general election, I got a glimpse of one of her interviews in which she was asked by a BBC journalist, why should the British voters go for her? And she said, because I have a plan. And then I was immediately reminded of Mike Tyson. His famous saying, everybody has a plan until I punch them in the nose. So, I don't want to be disparaging because I had a plan when I went to Brussels in January 2015. The result was not too different. But let's move beyond plans and punches that are delivered with such accuracy and venom by reality, because this is what we're facing. And let's talk about reality itself. We live in a strange world. Remember in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was elected in order to bring, what was it, morning in America? And the way in which he was going to do it was through unfettered markets and a small state that knows its place. It knows how to wither out of sight. Now we have Donald Trump, who talked about carnage in America in his inauguration and built a whole narrative of what is going to bring the United States out of its lethargy and make it great again on the basis of precisely the opposite, of moving away from unfettered markets, of moving in some direction of some kind of Trumpian protectionism. At the same time, since I spoke about Theresa May, recall that Theresa May also made a break from Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan's soulmate on the other side of the pond. She repeatedly admonished both, of course, the left's irresponsibility fiscally, but also the libertarian right's utter belief in unfettered markets. Meanwhile, on the other side of the British Channel, we have the complete collapse of the political center. You saw what happened last Sunday in France. The two major political parties disappeared, just completely, utterly disappeared. I come from a party where almost every political party has disappeared. We have, if abstention could take seats in parliament, we would have a crushing majority of empty seats. Similarly in France last Sunday. I want to put forward the hypothesis that all these phenomena, from Trump to Europe to developments in China, this nexus which binds our fates together, combining developments in Europe, and I include Britain in that. Let's not confuse the EU with Europe. The United States and China. Those developments can only be understood in the context of what I shall refer to as a major, radical coordination failure of a planetary magnitude. And allow me to make the point that what lies behind, in my estimation, the uncertainty that you face on your daily basis, the political turmoil in Europe and elsewhere, is a very simple fact. And being an economist, I can't stop being economically deterministic. So allow me to put forward what is fundamentally an economic hypothesis. Ladies and gentlemen, do you realize that, I'm sure you realize, but I need to state it just once more just to hear it, because it is such a startling fact. Since 1950, we have the largest saving ratio globally and the lowest investment ratio. Well, we can all go home now. This is it. This is the real cause of the turmoil, the real cause of the trouble that we find ourselves in globally. When you have a mountain of savings and a trickle of investment funding on investment into physical capital, gross capital formation. You realize that capitalism is not working. The tumult that we experience everywhere is the result of the fact that the money markets are not equilibrating savings and investment. Now, the question is, why is this happening? What does it mean? And what can be done to fix it? Well, as briefly as I can. The problem of equilibrating savings and investment has always been with us. Because let's face it, the money market is not like the market for potatoes or for cars. In any market of physical products, of services, in every microeconomic market, to put it this way, excess supply leads to a reduction in price, which then shrinks supply, boosts demand, equilibrates excess supply, problem solved. So when there are unsold potatoes, the price goes down and they get sold. Simultaneously, production of potatoes comes down. But in the money market, this doesn't happen. Because when you've got excess supply of savings, what is the price of investment funding? Well, the rate of interest. If the rate of interest comes down, that of course reduces the costs of borrowing to invest. But that is not what investors are all about. Investors do not care about money. They do not express demand for investment funding for its own sake. Unlike potatoes that you purchase because somebody wants to eat them, money is not edible. Money is only useful to the extent that it can be invested into productive processes that yield goods and services that can be sold. So if you're tossing and turning in the middle of the night, wondering whether you should invest in some new product, in some new production line, some new service, of course you care about the cost of borrowing. Of course you care about the cost of labor. But this is not what determines your decision to invest. What determines your decision to invest is some optimism that at the end of the production line, when your new good or service is produced, there is going to be demand for it. But that depends on what others like you, tossing and turning in the middle of the night, also decide. Because what you need in order to have sufficient aggregate demand is sufficient aggregate investment. So it is a genuine coordination problem. I always try, before I got into politics, I would try to explain this to my students, MBA students, graduate students, and so on in economics, by means of a very simple little trick. I would say to them, now, for the next assignment, I have to tell you that I really can't be bothered to mark it, because truly there's nothing worse than marking scripts. It's even worse than sitting in Eurogroup meetings. So let me just give you a grade now. Take out a piece of paper, write your name and your student number, and I want an integer between 1 and 9, including 1 and 9. And your grade will be determined by a very simple formula. I will pick up all those pieces of paper. I will choose the number, the integer that is the minimum integer chosen amongst you. That will be a common factor for all of you. I will multiply it by 11. That's common for all of you. Minimum times 11. And from that common factor, I shall subtract your choice. And that's your percentage. So if everybody chooses the maximum number, which is 9, the minimum is 9. 9 times 11, 99, minus yours, which is 9, 90%. Everybody gets 90%. Everybody gets an A+. Everybody passes. Everybody goes home right now. But of course, if everybody chooses 8, they get 80%. If they choose 4, they get 40%. 1, 10%. Now here, the beauty of this little example is that this is not a free-riding opportunity. It is not a prisoner's dilemma. You do not have an incentive to choose a low number while others are choosing a high number. You do not have an incentive to cheat. It's a coordination problem. Everybody would love everybody else to choose a high number, just like investors. Every investor would love everybody to invest, so they invest, so everybody makes money, and they make money. And if you think that others are going to invest, it is not in your interest not to invest yourself. You'll be left behind. Similarly, in this example, with the little grading game, as I call it. If you think others will choose 9, what's your point? Why would you choose 1? If you choose 1, the minimum is 1, you fail. The others fail, but you fail too. So the optimal strategy in this grading game is to choose the number that you think will be the minimum amongst everybody else. Similarly, not the same, but similarly in investment, everybody would like to imagine what others would be investing, the extent to which others will be investing, and they will invest more or less the same, but not more. So pessimism reproduces and reconfirms itself. Because if enough people believe that enough people will be pessimistic and therefore will invest very little, then everybody has an incentive to invest very little. And then, you know what? Lo and behold, investment is low. And they say, you see, we were right. But not because the equilibrium, the right answer is low investment. If they were all optimistic, or enough of them were optimistic, they would think, investment will be high, so let's invest. They would all invest, and then would say, oh, look, we were right. Investment is high, so we were right to invest. So this is the conundrum that we find ourselves in. Now imagine you are in the middle of the night, and you are tossing and turning in bed, and you are wondering, shall I invest or not? High investment, low investment strategies. And you can't sleep, so you switch on your smartphone, and you hear that Janet Yellen is thinking, against all odds, of reversing her interest rate policy and actually reducing interest rates in the United States today, or indulging in more QE. You think, what do you think? Oh, great. The costs of investing are going to be reduced because the rate of interest is coming down, or is it more likely that you think, oh no, for Janet Yellen to be reducing interest rates, things must be bad. You see, this is a tragedy with money markets. When things are bad and savings are high and investment is low, the price of money comes down, and instead of having equilibration, we have disequilibration. So tax cuts, interest rate reductions in the middle of a crisis may reduce the costs of production or the cost of investment. They may allow those with greater savings to keep more of it rather than to pay it to the taxman or woman. But they do not create more investment. They can actually have the opposite effect. Now, if you combine this with the most trying difficulty and incongruity since the beginnings of capitalism, which is the fact that we have two contradictory forces, two contradictory tendencies since the inception of capitalism. On the one hand, to create a common currency, to fix exchange rates. I heard the introduction today, you're particularly worried and concerned that the pound is going up. Sorry, down. I'm still stuck in 2015 territory. So the pound is coming down, the euro is going up, the dollar is going up and down, volatility. You're concerned about that. That's quite natural. So there is a tendency to try to create political mechanisms by which to dampen this volatility, to fix exchange rates, to reduce the volatility in the fluctuations of exchange rates. It's quite natural. But if you think about it, the natural limit of this is the gold standard, Bretton Woods, the euro, the US dollar, Mexican peso peg, the Chinese peg. This is the natural conclusion of this limit. The moment you peg currencies together of surplus and deficit regions of the world, what you're doing effectively, in the interests of doing away with volatility and uncertainty, you're causing a massive tsunami of capital that will flow with probability 1 from the surplus, from the banks of the surplus region to the deficit regions. And why is this? Because whenever you have a chronic current, let me give you a random example. Take Germany and Greece, totally randomly. Every Mercedes-Benz that gets sold, or Volkswagen, that gets sold in Greece, means that there's a wad of money going from a Greek bank through the Target 2 system of the European Central Bank to a bank in Frankfurt. Yep. So cars go one way, money comes the other way. So that immediately creates a glut of money in Frankfurt and a shortage of liquidity in a place like Greece. That immediately means that the real rate of interest in a place like Frankfurt is going to be dampened, and the real rate of interest in a place like Greece is going to go up. Immediately, the bankers of Frankfurt have a cause, have an incentive to shift very large parts of that lake of liquidity from Frankfurt to a place like Greece, by which to extract the higher rate of interest. Now, this causes a period of exuberant growth, both in Greece and in Germany. Remember the 2000s. This is what happened after the creation of the euro. Greece was growing at 5.5%, 8% in nominal GDP terms. We were the miracle of Europe. Do you remember that? No, you don't remember that, because lots of things have happened since then, but we were. Greece and Ireland had the highest growth rates between 1998 and 2008. This is why German bankers and French bankers, even sillier, were rushing to Greece to lend as if there was no tomorrow. Yeah? The Greek debt did not happen surreptitiously. There was a mechanism, a dynamic behind it. Okay? So this is what happens. It's not just Greece and Germany. Think of US and Mexico, US and Argentina during the PEG era, 1920s, the gold exchange standard era. It happened, the European exchange rate mechanism period, that ill-fated, awful design, still had that effect. It happens every time that you try to respond to the investors and to the business persons' demand for less volatility in exchange rates by means of fixing exchange rates. This is what you get. And of course, because this is a Ponzi scheme, this is like me going into a car dealer and saying, I want your car and I want the money to buy it with. So it's vendor financing, which is exponential. This kind of growth can only continue when debt, private debt, public debt, doesn't really matter. There's people say, oh, look at Ireland and Greece, they're very different. They're not different. The only difference was that in Ireland, it was the private sector that became hugely indebted. In Greece, it was the public sector. The result was exactly the same. Bankruptcy of the state in both cases, either directly, as in Greece, or indirectly through Anglo-Irish and so on in Ireland. And then, of course, the bubble bursts, because this is what happens when you build pyramids, and clueless politicians who couldn't see this coming, even though it happens every time, try to fix it. And how do they try to fix it? With an extremely short-term agenda. So in the case of Greece, in the case of Spain, of Ireland, of Italy, they dealt with it as if this was a Greek problem or an Irish problem or an Italian problem. Never did the European Union sit down and treat a systemic crisis systematically. Similarly, think of Latin America and Central America. By the time Brady bonds came to clear up the mess, a whole generation had been depleted. Think of Argentina. We're still mopping up after that disaster. So there is, on the one hand, the tendency to fix exchange rates. There's, on the other hand, reality punching your plan in the nose and causing massive social deprivation as a result of politicians who are in power when the bubbles burst. Firstly, analytically incapable of understanding what happened, and secondly, morally and politically not strong enough in order to say, you know what, we cannot deal with this problem by means of a combination of more loans and austerity, which saps the incomes of those in deficit and in debt. Call me Greece. So, what really happened in 2008? Between the 1970s and 2008, we had a very interesting global flow of capital and commodities. Think about it. The Bretton Woods system, which had fixed exchange rates, was predicated on the idea that the United States was a surplus country that would be recycling its surpluses to equilibrate and coordinate these problems between surpluses and deficits. That's what the Marshall Plan was. That was what American policy vis-à-vis opening its markets to Japan was. It was a hegemonic attempt to politically manage the flow of goods and of capital in a global regime of fixed exchange rates. But that died in 1971 with the Nixon shock. Why did it die? Because America lost its surpluses. And then we had a second period between the mid-1970s, let's say, and 2008, during which the global financial flows and goods flows and trade flows were effectively managed by America's twin deficits. The American deficits operated like a huge vacuum cleaner that sucked into the territory of the United States the net exports of Germany, of the Netherlands, of Japan, later China, and closing the circle by sucking into Wall Street 70% of global profits. So there was recycling. But 2008 with the meltdown of the financial sector, even though the financial sector was reflated a year later by the actions of A, central banks, the Fed primarily, but not just the Fed, and B, China, that inflated its credit bubble in order to give Western capitalism, the Europeans and the Americans, an opportunity to get their act together. Even though it was reflated, it never managed to play again the role of closing the loop and using America's deficits or anybody's deficits in order to provide the requisite demand to German, Dutch, Chinese, and Japanese factories so as to maintain the level of aggregate investment where it was. So if we have failed to produce coordination after 2008, if this crisis is continuing, if Macron managed to win not just the presidency but the National Assembly elections at the expense of the main parties, if Brexit prevailed, if Donald Trump is coming, this is all underpinned by the punch of reality, which has to do, it's a kind of nemesis following the hubris of us collectively failing to come to terms with a major coordination failure sparked off by 2008, which we have never managed to deal with, even to discuss sensibly. So populists, xenophobes, racists, and tumult in general is the price we pay globally for our failure politically to come to terms with our economic reality. Thank you very much. That's it. Good.
Great. Thanks for your comments, Yanis. You managed to explain the euro crisis and the Trump trade all in one clean framework. And it's one I'm sympathetic to, the idea that we have this global glut of savings and not enough investment. I want to start off by talking about that, actually. So when I talk to policymakers about investing more, particularly in this country, and say it will drive GDP growth, the response I get is, who cares about GDP growth? You're such an Anglo-Saxon. We have a high standard of living and low unemployment. So why should we care? And I understand you're saying it's a coordination problem, but what would your answer to them be on that? Why should they care? In Japan or in Germany, where unemployment is really low, standard of living is really high.
Well, since we're in Germany, you might as well pay respect to this nation and address Germany. Well, Germany has, what was the last figure? 8.7% current account surplus?
Something like that, yeah.
Moving up.
Yeah.
Now, what does this mean? It means that the hard-working Germans have to send their savings to the spendthrift. That's what it means. This is not something that hard-working Germans like to do. But this is what they have to do. Because if you have a chronic current account surplus, then if you are constantly saving more than you invest, saving more than you spend, you're going to have to take your savings, since you cannot lend them to anyone in this country because there isn't enough demand for it, you're going to have to give it to the Greeks. And if not to the Greeks, you have to give it to somebody that you mistrust. So the hard-working German investors are forced to effectively hand over their future to jurisdictions and to companies and to peoples that they have no control over. I don't think that hard-working Germans like that. And it is not conducive to equilibrium in the long term, dynamic equilibrium. Let's face it. What is keeping Germany growing? It's China. It's really very simple. And what is keeping China in a position to perform this role for Germany? A credit bubble. Do the Germans really want to have their future rely on a credit bubble? I do not believe that, having many, many friends in this country, that they can go to sleep at night safe in the thought that their future nest egg depends on a credit bubble. Wolfgang Schäuble was very clear. He said quite recently that he disparages the very low interest rates of the European Central Bank because they are the ones that are feeding the monster of xenophobia and the AfD in this country. And he's right. Now, of course, he's shooting the messenger.
Yeah. Do you think that German investors, though, have a long enough time frame to think about what might happen when that credit bubble bursts, or they're just going for the easy
They
win?
probably don't. And this is the tragedy that we all face. And this is not a criticism of German investors. It's a criticism of all of us.
Investors,
You know, we are like the grasshopper, not the ant, globally.
Yeah.
We're thinking of today. We're not thinking of the future. You cannot continue along the path, we cannot continue along the path that we are on.
Yeah.
It's simply not sustainable.
So to talk a little bit about the future in Europe, your experience going from Athens to Brussels, it was a big shock, a big change. Things are done differently in Brussels. I think everyone can agree.
Actually, no.
No. Oh, well,
The amount of incompetence in Brussels is, you know, it's Olympic gold standard.
But in terms of processes,
Seriously.
tell us how you really feel, Yanni. In terms of processes, though, things are done a little bit differently. So knowing what you know now about processes and negotiating style, what would you have done differently, and what would you tell Theresa May to do, given that she's, in theory, going to have to go to Brussels and try to negotiate Brexit?
I remember in a discussion I had with Larry Summers sometime in April, when I was still minister, he said to me, Yanis, you made a very big mistake, mate. He didn't say mate, I'm adding that. Larry does not use the word mate. He said, you made a very big mistake. I thought, oh my God. Larry, so what was my mistake like? He said, you won the election. So I think that was my greatest mistake. But no, look, the greatest mistake was to trust that our team had an agreement amongst ourselves that we would stick to. Because between you and I, don't tell anyone now, things were really very simple at the beginning of 2015. Yes, we were a party of the hard left, but what we went to Brussels with was not a leftist agenda. You remember that, Megan. It was a very simple agenda. It was indeed, when I put it to several friends of mine in the United States, financiers, they said to me, well, that is that is what a Wall Street bankruptcy lawyer would have come up with, this set of proposals. We said we want a debtor structure that would allow us to have a modest but reachable primary surplus target so that we could reduce tax rates for business, VAT, and so on, in order to stimulate the economy, have an investment bank to create some kind of homegrown investment, and a bad bank to deal with NPLs. Now, how left-wing is that? But it took a hard left finance minister to come up with what would be a bankruptcy lawyer's proposals. So this, I don't regret going to them with this. What I do regret doing was I regret trusting that reason would prevail in the Eurogroup at some point. They would see that this would be in their own benefit, that they would get more of their money back if we went down this road, rather than the road that they followed in the end. So that was, yeah, maybe I was naive in this. And I was naive in believing that my own team, my Prime Minister in particular, and I would stick together through hell or high water and say no to more loan tranches that add to our unsustainable debt on conditions of shrinking our incomes. So what I would have done differently? I would have brought on a clash with the troika of lenders within the first month. I would not have waited until June. Mm-hmm. So you see, I'm just beyond salvation.
Okay. But on that basis, what's your advice to Theresa May, who now has to go in, and arguably the Europeans don't understand what the risks are for them of Brexit?
Well, let me just say that the narrative now has changed completely as a result of the hung parliament. By the way, I think that this hung parliament is the best thing that could have happened for Britain and for the European Union. It is an amazingly good outcome, because now maybe there is a possibility that some sense is going to be knocked into Mrs. May's head, and that we are now going to go for what is the only possible long-term sustainable solution, which is a 6-year period, let's say 5-6 years, of an interim Norway-style European Economic Area agreement. So what you do is you can't say to the British people, you voted for Brexit, we are going to ignore it. We're Democrats, we have to respect it. But at the same time, let's remember that a referendum is a binary choice. They chose Brexit, but they didn't choose what kind of Brexit. And Megan, what was the strongest argument in favor of Brexit from a political philosophy, liberal perspective, Burkean perspective, to restore sovereignty to the House of Commons? Well, restore it. Let the House of Commons decide what long-term future the United Kingdom wants with the EU. But that takes 5 years to decide. the 2-year period of supposed negotiations is not going to give them any such chance, and there will be no negotiations. So
There's only 1 year now.
exactly. So my advice to her, I've even written op-eds about this, is very, very simple. Don't negotiate, because you cannot negotiate. You will waste the next year negotiating for the right to negotiate, which is not going to be granted. And in the end, the only thing that Mr. Barnier, Mr. Juncker, Mrs. Merkel fear the most is a mutually advantageous agreement coming out of negotiations. They do not want a mutually advantageous agreement. They want one that teaches any other recalcitrants in Europe that if you challenge Brussels, you get a bloody nose, even if the peoples of Europe end up suffering as well. So the only way of not negotiating is either you pick up stumps and you leave, which would be catastrophic, or you table for an off-the-shelf, you table a request for an off-the-shelf agreement, Switzerland-like or Norway style. Now, if she had won a landslide victory, she could not have gone that way because she's already proclaimed that she wants a hard Brexit. Why would she want to say this? I don't know. But anyway. Well, now, with the bloody nose permanently featuring on her face, she gets an opportunity to escape the trap that she set up for herself.
Yeah. Interesting. Though it could go horribly, horribly wrong.
Yes, but with a hung parliament, there's a better chance that it won't go horribly wrong. Small chance, but we had a 0 chance before that.
Right, yeah. And what about the rest of Europe? Because you spend a lot of time traveling around Europe talking to policymakers. We have a new president in France who looks like he's going to have an absolute majority in Parliament. We've got the German elections coming up. Do you see anything shifting off the basis of this new leadership?
Well, the developments in France are major, because let's face it, France is the battleground for the euro.
And you've written on both sides on Macron. You've written to support him and to denounce him. So,
well, allow me to explain this. Firstly, I consider him to be a friend. We have a very good personal relationship. I personally like the guy. I think he's a splendid chap. Yeah? And he understands the problems, the architectural problems of the Eurozone. However, I disagree with his policies. And I disagree with how he's trying to get to what I think is the right aim, the right destination. So we agree on what needs to be done. But I disagree severely with the way he's thinking of achieving it. His view is very simple, Megan, and I think you know that. We haven't had a chance to discuss this before, but I think we know the same story. His view is that, okay, for about a year, he's going to pass through the French National Assembly legislation, especially for the labor markets, that Germany passed 15 years ago. The Hartz-IV reforms, the Schroeder agenda, and so on. Which is too late to do in Germany, in France now. These kinds of microeconomic reforms work only during a period of rising investment. Yeah. If investment is falling and you give companies the opportunity to fire and Uberize workers, you are not going to create more jobs. During periods of increasing investment, if you give more opportunities to large companies to have more control over whom they fire and whom they hire, they will create good jobs, but because investment is rising. So he's going to expand his political capital and popularity to pass through Parliament measures that will not work in the direction that he wants, so as to go to Berlin, well, come to Berlin, I should say, and say to Merkel in a year's time, look, I've Germanized France. Now we have a German France. Yield on federation. We want a common budget, we want common unemployment insurance, we want a proper banking union, all the things that we really need. You know what she's going to say to him? Nope, not doing it. And then where is Macron going to be? He will have expanded his political capital and he will not get a meaningful federation, a macroeconomically significant federation.
Why do you say that she'll say no?
Because she will have no reason to say yes.
Okay. So institutional change for Europe isn't coming?
I hold Angela Merkel in the highest regard. I'm actually quite, this is terrible, but I'm quite happy that she's going to be re-elected, because I distrust Martin Schulz and the SPD immensely. I dealt with them. They were my comrades. They talked to me as if we were friends. We were going to have the revolution together. And then 5 minutes later, they were worse than Schäuble. I prefer Schäuble any day. This two-faced SPD kind of policy, language is just appalling. So I'm glad that Merkel is, and especially given her splendid and outstanding moral leadership on the refugee issue, which of course then was snuffed out by her party, but nevertheless, I hold her in the highest esteem. But I think she's missed her chance. Her chance of leading Europe down the path of federation was 2010, 2011. She had to do it. It would have been fantastic for Germany to do it. Europe would have been a different place now. But now I think she's winning her last term in office. Already her control over the CDU has diminished. Can she deliver that which Macron is asking? No, I don't think she can, even if she wants to anymore. And she can certainly not deliver anything which is something more than cosmetic.
Okay. On that uplifting thought. Sadly, we've run out of time, but I will point out that there's a session later that with Yanis that all of you can fire rapid-fire questions at him during. So let's all give him a round of applause.
Let's thank Yanis and Megan. Sorry about the pronunciation. Well done. Thank you.